Hello patron and welcome back to my life. It's Writer Wednesday, where I give you my tips and advice on the art and the business of writing and tell you how I do what I do as an indie author. This week's question comes from Pim Claysons on Patreon, who asked how I determine what role gender and specifically transgender characters and issues play in my story worlds. And this is of course a bit of a follow-up question to my earlier Writer Wednesday video about writing women and other non-straight white guy characters. So as Pim points out, there are three basic ways that you can deal with this in your books. One, it doesn't exist at all. That's obviously no good, it's not true to life, etc., all the stuff I normally talk about. And it's not to say that every single story you tell must have a trans character or must focus on trans issues or whatever, but if you leave it out of all of your work, your second option is to have trans characters exist, but have nothing particularly, special about it. There's no discrimination faced by them or no special issues or anything like that. It's no big deal. And that's what I've chosen to do in the world of Underrealm. Trans people exist. There is no transphobia or trans discrimination. They are just there and they are like any other characters. The reasons why I do that have been discussed elsewhere. The short version, as Pim says, is that it demonstrates that a world with trans people does not just somehow collapse in on itself and go all to hell. As I've also mentioned before, and I just want to note very briefly, the danger that you do run into with that is that you can be seen as pretending that such discrimination and such issues don't exist in our world, when of course they do, and that is a risk that you take when writing that kind of story, and just so you're aware of that. The third option is to have trans people and trans issues exist, but trans people are discriminated against to greater or lesser degree, and it is more or less a focus of the story. So this can be very powerful storytelling and can highlight real issues that real people face in the real world, but there are, as always, a couple of things to watch out for. First is that it is easy to fall into the trap of portraying trans issues as the only distinguishing factor in the lives of trans people. You see something similar a lot in movies about gay people, for example. It is a common trope and a complaint in the gay community that whenever you have gay characters as the main characters of a movie, it ends tragically. Somebody dies, or it's a bad ending. And yes, trans people do face intense discrimination, and that should be confronted, and stories should be told about it, but you do run the risk, as with any character, of defining them by only a single trait, which in this case is their transness. But they are actual people. It is possible to tell stories about trans people where they are just like another character, where good things happen to them as well, where every single moment of every single day does not that's not the only thing that they're always thinking about all the time. But the second, and in my mind, far more important thing to watch out for is that if you tell a story that centers on trans people and trans issues, you very much run the risk of speaking over, or in some cases, shouting over, actual trans authors and creators who should be telling those stories. So look at this graph right here. Right now, there is a sharp rise in black characters in books and fiction, and there is not a corresponding sharp rise of black authors in books and fiction. That means that a bunch of white people are jumping in and telling stories about black characters and black issues instead of actual black authors. Publishers are taking white people and saying, we gotta write a story about black people, rather than finding good black authors who exist, who are out there in the world, and getting them to tell those stories. And that's not just mind-blowingly infuriating at all. And this is exactly, by the way, why I'm making the transition from author to publisher. I realized eventually that I might be doing more harm than good by trying to tell diverse stories with diverse characters, because at best, I would be taking up space that should be occupied by diverse creators. So instead, I want to find great black authors and publish them. I want to find trans authors and have them tell stories about what it's like to be trans. Because as an author, writing inclusive stories with inclusive characters for broad audiences or niche audiences is a step that you can take to help people who are part of marginalized communities, like ethnic minorities or the LGBT community, etc. But drowning out their voices by telling a story that belongs to them and therefore creating less space for them to tell that story is kind of the number one thing you should not do in order to be a good ally. One particularly egregious example is a guy who recently wrote a story about a sci-fi story about an alternative universe where America never abolished slavery. And his work was praised as brave and daring for, combining slavery and science fiction, completely ignoring the fact that Octavia E. Butler did this 40 years before he did. On a similar note, and more pertinent to the question at hand, we constantly see cisgendered men win accolades and awards for playing transgendered characters in film. They play trans women in film. You got your Jared Leto in the Dallas Buyers Club, and anyway, examples abound. You know what I'm talking about. This is disturbing. It forwards the idea that being a trans woman is a performance and not an actual part of who the person is. And there are trans women actors out there. They are plentiful. Some of them are really, really good. You don't have to get Eddie Redmayne to play a trans woman. You could just get Jamie Clayton, or there's a whole list. There's lots of them. Again, you've got cisgendered men who are usually also white and straight, because of course they are, taking the space of and telling stories instead of the people who they supposedly want to uplift and represent. Like, trans women wouldn't need your representation if you'd just let them speak for themselves. So then the answer to the question of how do I determine what role gender will play in my story and my world is obviously quite a tricky one. First of all, it depends on what kind of story are you trying to tell. What purposes and themes are you going to explore, and how can you use gender issues, and specifically transgender issues, to tell that story. But then second, you have to think of the effects of your story outside itself. What consequences will occur to you and to your readers and to other people, other creators in the real world, because stories do not exist in a vacuum. The good news is that there are a lot of resources out there to help teach you how to do this better. You should be reading trans authors and following trans creators on YouTube and elsewhere, and you should be supporting them as much as you can, whether it's by buying one of their books or like finding them on Patreon and supporting them that way, if it's possible. The amount of free education out there is astounding. You should absolutely try to avail yourself of it, but you should also try to give back in whatever way you can. That's it for this week, patron. Thank you, Pim, for what was a very difficult but hopefully a very interesting question. As always, if anyone else has something they would like me to discuss, drop it in the comments below and I will address it in a future Writer Wednesday video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next Wednesday. Bye!